your strategy worked. Oh, no, I know. No, I know.
Actually, like, I looked at it, I saw I couldn't do this going at it, not actually looking at it, and the truth is, it's very possible to do it, but
It's fine. No, it's fine. And actually, I was kind of laid back and offered to do it. I was like, piano, but I thought, no, let's just do this. And there are some people who are totally linear, but what I find is, like in the liturgy, when you got an E flat comma, and it shows up in the accompaniment of the to it, and then it just makes it natural because people, when they hear that, the key changes for them intuitively. It's like for people who read music, we have to go through the mental gymnastics and see, oh, okay, now we're going to keep it flat, so we do this and all that kind of stuff. And for people who don't read, it's just intuitive. So anyway, but it worked fine. So let's just since I'm starting 2 new classes in a Ulster on Tuesday, and answer my business.
Felt things, and then leave them on the floor, and they disappear. They disappear. It's a problem. It's okay. It'll be fine. I'm just going to use the screens, which is what I had on printed out anyway. We're going to have a great conversation together. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. All right. I never know, am I in the frame? If I stand over here, do I have to go over here? This is good? This is good? Okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to ACE. It's good to have you here today. So, a little background on our topic this morning. What does this mean? Catechism, confirmation, and ever-transforming faith. This is what I come up with. I think, Jennifer, does this kind of sound like what we were talking about? That's good? Okay, good. So the Christian Ed team and I sat down a couple months ago, and we had this conversation about ways that we could have some interesting things in ACE that were not only lecture-based, right? Because we do a lot of this in ACE, which is good, where we have a presenter and they talk and you listen. And then you get to ask questions at the end, and that's about it. And that's great. That's great. Some topics, that's the right method, right? But it's not the only way that we learn, is it? Grown-ups? No? I always blame children for things like this, that for kids and for children's ministry, we know that kids don't only learn by listening and asking questions, but by being involved in things. And so we're going to take like just a baby step with this series toward not lecture-based, okay? But some of that, for sure. Some of that. So So the idea here is that, let me see. Nope. Okay, so confirmation, catechism, and an ever-transforming faith. How old were you when you were in confirmation? 7th and 8th grade, right? Raise your hand if that's been a couple years. Right? A few years, right? So we typically have confirmation, this really important, informative time, and it's one of my favorite things that I get to do, so I really believe in it. But we're doing this with young people that have all sorts of other things going on in their lives, and they're distracted, and especially lately, oh my goodness, we get our kids coming to confirmation, and I say, "Hi, everybody," and they say, "Hi." And they're tired, and they've got a lot going on that they're dealing with, and they are navigating some complicated things, just like all the rest of you, right? And one of my great beliefs about confirmation is that we absolutely should do it at this time in their lives, and also we're not quite ready to absorb the full impact, right, of what confirmation is and all the faith learning and the growth that we do during this time. And so, this session, this series, starting with our session today, is an acknowledgement that we do not somehow master faith when we finish confirmation, right? Because if you think back to that time in your life, a lot has changed for you since then, and your faith has grown since that time, and you may or may not have had Christian educational sessions that have come alongside you and helped form your faith, or had conversations like we do in confirmation to form your faith. And so, if we say, like Martin Luther King Jr. did here, that faith is taking the first step when you don't see the whole staircase, you've been on the staircase since you were confirmed, so to speak, and your life has been evolving, your faith has been evolving, and God has walked with you the whole way. And I'm willing to bet that you understand a few things in your faith in different ways than you did when you were confirmed. I think this is healthy and good. And so we're going to kind of revisit some of the confirmation stuff in light of who you are now, how your faith has evolved since then, and how it can look different for different people in the life of faith. So to get us started, not so scary, pretty easy I think, let's turn to a neighbor and discuss this question, okay? What do you remember about your own confirmation experience? This doesn't have to be content. It can be who your leader was, or what crazy thing the pastor did at that time, or how you were terrified of getting up and having to recite something memorized in front of the church. Whatever it is, open-ended question here. Turn to a neighbor or two and discuss what you remember about your own confirmation experience. Ten more seconds, and then we're going to wrap it up. Okay. You obviously had some good things to talk about, or at least maybe some memorable things to talk about, whether or not they would be good by your standards. Okay, so thank you for talking together. Who is brave enough to share something from your conversations that you think others would appreciate or find interesting? Who's willing to share with a large group? Susan. Ah. Oh, okay. Okay, so interesting. I'll summarize that since I did not. I should probably grab the microphone here and have you all say this so that we can hear you. I think what I heard you say, Susan, is that despite some generational differences here, you both had the experience of having to memorize something that you may or may not have felt like you understood very well in front of the congregation, and that you didn't really feel like you understood a lot of what you were supposed to be learning in confirmation in the first place. And I'm seeing some nods, so yes, okay. So that's maybe another layer here, right, is that we're trying to explain or do some learning around adult level content to people who are not at adult level brain formation yet. They're still learning in their abstract thinking and some of that stuff, okay? Thank you for that. We don't always feel like we understand, and some recitation. That sounds terrifying, okay? Anybody else? Please. Here we go.
Pastor at Firm Glory, she kept in touch with him, and on our honeymoon, we went to see him in Milwaukee.
Okay.
Anyway.
Yeah.
I got to meet Pastor at Firm.
Oh, cool. So there's also this sense of relationship in your story, right? You've obviously built the kind of relationship with your confirmation pastor that you wanted to see that person again. They didn't terrify you away from the church, and that you got to kind of nurture that relationship throughout your life. Good.
I kind of want to ask Larry if the pastor went on the rest of the honeymoon with you then.
Oh boy.
It's very unique. That's great.
Oh boy. Okay. Yeah. Good. Thank you for that story. Great. Anybody else? Anything else interesting or unique in flavor to what we've heard so far? You all were so forthcoming and sharing in your pairs, and then we asked for the large group, and all of a sudden it's different, right? That's okay. That's also a good reason why we have small groups in confirmation, because we're better able to share when we have smaller groups of people than in a bigger setting. Okay? All right. So now we're going to turn to people. You don't have to talk to the same people this time. You can find a different buddy to talk to, or the same one, and discuss how your life has changed since you were confirmed. What has happened in your lives since you were 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th grade? Ready, go. Ready, go. right, 10 more seconds. We'll wrap up our conversations here. Okay. This time I won't ask you to share because there's probably some similar flavors that you had in your smaller group conversations, but the point standing, our lives have changed since the time that we were confirmed in our faith in the church. If we wanted to be intentional about this, we might even say we could affirm our faith again and again and again and again, right? That maybe once a year we would all have an affirmation service for one another to say, yes, I still believe, and yes, this is important and vibrant to me. We'll put it on the calendar, right? A whole congregation affirmation Sunday. That could be interesting. Interesting. Okay, I like it. So this is the slightly more lecture-based part. Okay. So thank you for talking to each other. Nicely done. So the title of this series is What Does This Mean? That, of course, if you did any kind of memorizing in confirmation, you will remember that comes from Luther's Small Catechism. I don't know if this is the particular brand of catechism that you used in confirmation, but this is what mine looked like. Was the 1970s orangish one. And this is the version that I have memorized. If you get a different catechism in a different era, the phrasing is slightly different. And that becomes interesting to try to recite things together if you have a different catechism articulation. Anyway, so what does this mean was Luther's central question in the Small Catechism. It's what he wanted to ask and invite the people of God to ask about the essential tenets of our faith so that faith meant something for them and wasn't just a duty or an obligation or something that they, were supposed to believe, but that it had some meat on its bones and it meant something important in their daily lives. So Luther invited us through this little teeny tiny booklet to ask the question, what does this mean? So that's where we're going with all this, right? Who can remember, quiz time, one of the three main parts of Luther's Small Catechism? Who can remember one of them? You don't have to remember all three. What's one of the main parts of Luther's Small Catechism? The Ten Commandments! Gold star for you, very good. Someone paid attention in confirmation. Susan knows the secret. The Small Catechism is in fact included in some of the last pages of your red hymnal. So if you ever want to see something about the Small Catechism and you don't have your little orange book, you can turn into the back of the hymnal and it's all right in there for you. Okay? So 10 Commandments. Do you have another one you want to share since you know? The Lord's Prayer. Yes. And the third one? The Creed. Very good. See, we're already passing. Good job, everybody. The 10 Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and the Creed. Now, raise your hand, and this is a little honesty time. If you have ever come to church on a Sunday morning and simply recited these things from memory and not really given much thought to what it means for you, right? A little bit of truth to that, right? That some days, maybe we're in a really spiritually open and mentally aware place, and when we're praying this, we're like, oh, the prayer, for example, oh my gosh, I never thought about that phrase before, right? Or sometimes we'll have sermon series on these things, and we'll expound on what this means in particular for us. But I think, if we're being honest, a lot of us come to worship when we say, especially the prayer and the creed, and because we know the words by heart, it's a little tempting to just say it and not think about the meaning each and every time, right? So Luther wanted to kind of push us on this point and say, it's not enough simply to pray the words, it's not enough to just repeat the creed. We want to think about what this means for us and why it's something that we include every single Sunday in worship as a central part of our life of faith, okay? He also included a couple little small bonus sections in the Catechism on baptism and what it means for us, on confession and what that means for us, on communion and what that means. Also, he had morning and evening blessings and blessings for meal times, okay? There's little teeny tiny pieces in this. In a world in which we consume 140 characters of information and anything beyond that is way too long, Luther was actually ahead of his curve on this because this is a short little document that we can turn to and get a concise but helpful piece of information about what any of these parts of our faith mean. So all that's in there if you ever want to revisit some of that. Now, why this question? Why did Luther ask what this means for life and share this with all the people? So he included in the Catechism Christian instruction and their explanations because he felt so strongly that faith was kind of divorced from daily life for people, right? That it was a realm of, you come to church and you think about faith, or you hear the pastor give a sermon, and you kind of leave it in that realm. But Luther really wanted to invite the people to kind of claim their faith in a different way and to take responsibility for it so that they could have this as a working model for their life, right? What this means for them. And so he gave these, his intentions in the Catechism were to give explanations that were brief and plain and simple. Now, if you came to Dr. Mark Tranvik's session on the objects of the Reformation, why do you think it was important for these explanations to be brief and simple and plain for the people? Many of them were illiterate. They couldn't read, right? Yeah. They weren't very educated, those who could read, right? And so if you're creating a document for people to take home and use, it needed to be something that they could actually use, right? And accessible so that it wasn't over their heads or the language wasn't too verbose or fancy that they couldn't understand what it meant, right? If the people couldn't get it, the point was lost. So he kept it brief and plain and simple, something that we could actually learn and carry with us in our real lives. Because these were Luther's observations at the time of writing the Catechism. As a parish pastor, which he was at the time, he felt that regular people knew nothing about the Christian faith. This was his real pulse on the people. And what? He'd been a parish pastor for years by this time. So it's not as though he was brand new and out of touch with where the people were at. He didn't feel like people knew anything about the Christian faith. And also, his perspective as a parish pastor was that pastors were unskilled and incompetent teachers. We have the blind leading the blind here, was kind of Luther's pulse on where people were at and why the situation was happening. So if the common people come to church to learn about their faith, and as if Luther was correct here, that pastors were not even that skilled or competent to begin with, what good was this doing together for the people for actually knowing something about their faith that they could use in their real lives? So Luther decided that wasn't good, and he should do something about that. So he wrote this little book so that parents could teach it to their children at home, right? Parents have been and will always be the #1 most important teachers for their children. Whether you're teaching children something specific or you're teaching them by not saying anything about things, you are teaching your children something. And Luther knew that. So he wanted to equip parents to know what to teach to their children and to have a resource that they could actually use and draw upon this. So he felt that if people had this little instruction booklet, that they would actually know the central parts of their faith as a step 1, and that they would know what they mean, okay? All right, so that was duplicate there. So now we have this small catechism from Luther, and we use it in confirmation to teach people, and we have been for many, many decades in the Lutheran Church. So now, I want you to talk to each other again in light of all this, and say, before you talked about how your life has changed since confirmation, this time I'd like you to shift that a little bit and talk about how your faith has changed since then. Okay? How has your faith changed? This one might be a little harder to reflect back on what you believed at the time you were confirmed, but how has your faith evolved or transformed since the day you were confirmed? Ready, go. guys are doing all the work. You're doing a great job. Actually, I probably should say God is doing all the work, right? God is the one doing it. Cool. That's right. That's right. Yeah. And people have a lot to say. Look at this. Good. All right, I'm going to draw you all back together for a couple minutes. And this time I really do want to see if we can get some good flavors here from people, some good conversations. If you are brave enough, please be brave. This is a comfortable space together. What's an area of your faith that has changed since then? What were some of your answers to this question? Even if you don't want to go into like a whole long thing, if you are willing to share for us, one of the things I always say to the kids is that if you have a question, somebody else probably has that question, and nobody wants to be the one to admit that they have that question, right, and embarrass themselves. But the other people who have that same question are going to be so glad you asked. So I believe that that's true with this, right? If you have something that you feel like is a good answer to this, I bet somebody else is going to be, 8 other heads are nodding along as you say this.
So we were talking about how as kids we're kind of lambs and we just follow.
Ooh.
And as adults we're sheep, and sheep kind of sometimes just go on their own little path and on their own way.
Okay.
And as adults and growing, we have a lot more of the doubting Thomas moments and a lot more of the I need answers and I have questions and that kind of stuff more now than we did when we were kids and in confirmation and that kind of stuff.
That's right. Ooh, interesting. It becomes a little more urgent, a little more important to have answers to some things. Yeah, thank you for that. Good. Good. Okay, who else? You all had so much to say about this in your smaller conversations. Thanks, Elisa. We can all be brave together.
I will try to be brave. Okay, so in my confirmation, I grew up Wisconsin Synod Lutheran, and so there was a lot of fire and brimstone when I was in confirmation, and so it made me a little bit afraid of my faith, I suppose. Or afraid to not, to question my faith. I guess maybe that was more of it. Was afraid to find those answers because I should already know them, because otherwise I was going somewhere else. So,
and where is that somewhere else? If you didn't know the answer.
H-E-double hockey sticks.
If you haven't been to work, if you didn't come to the first service, our theme for today is Jesus and hell. So it's just fascinating the ways that these themes come together.
But I think since then, I've come to understand through different experiences and just life and things like that, that there's a different way for that, and that that was not Jesus' intention, and that faith is more than that, more than that. So I don't know where I lost my train of thought, but I mean, I just have learned that I want to say it's more gentle faith, a more giving, finding that stuff out rather than just avoiding the pain and suffering that's going to happen if I, mess up. So
lots of avoidance.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Great. Thank you. That's right. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I know from conversations with a number of you that we have a broad range of denominational upbringings in this group even, and more so in the whole congregation. So thanks for sharing that, especially that what type of church you go through confirmation, or even just, children's ministry, Christian ed, can vary a lot and shape the tone that you get in some of these ministry programs. Wisconsin Synod, Missouri Synod, Catholic, ELCA, Baptist, Methodist, whatever. And it's not to say that our way is the better way, but that each type of that colors the way that you hear everything else in faith. Yeah. I sometimes will joke that Catholics are my favorite Lutherans because they really appreciate grace in a big way, right? Whereas for those of us who grew up in the ELCA and we've been in the ELCA our whole life, it can be easy to take it for granted because that's the whole system we've had the whole time, is this flavor of grace, right? Okay? Anybody else willing to share? What has changed in your faith since the time that you were confirmed? can be a small thing, it can be a big thing. It can be a roller coaster of highs and lows and all the things in between. Well, it's interesting to see that when we talk together, we do have a lot to say, because this is the real stuff of our lives, right? I would say working with youth in confirmation still, one of the big things that I see in kids is that they start confirmation with this like 10 Commandments legalism faith. And what I mean by that is the idea that the whole point of faith is so I don't steal and I don't cheat and I don't lie and I listen to my parents and I avoid the bad things. And then God will be really pleased with me. And that's it, right? And faith is so much more than that. Because I can't believe that all of you go in your daily lives and are just trying to avoid the bad things so that you avoid the bad place, right? It has to be more. It has to mean beyond that. And instead of just avoiding the bad, how do we pursue the good and the generous and the loving and the serving and the forgiveness that we have together? And so it's always fascinating to hear where kids are at with their faith when they start confirmation and hear the ways that they've transformed and broadened their perspectives by the time they finish confirmation and then beyond. And so where you all are at now as adults, living with a faith that matters to you enough that you continue to make faith a priority in your life. And you do. So good job on that account. Great. Faith has always changed since we have grown in the years in between confirmation, and it will for the rest of your lives. I also want to point out with this question that this kind of, it can jar us a little bit. How do I say this well? There is a thought that because God is always constant and does not change, that means that our understanding should never evolve, right? As though if God does not change, then the idea or understanding or interpretation of God that we first get must be the whole and complete and right one, and so our understanding must never change. But we are people who learn and grow as designed by the one who created us, right? And so if we did not grow and change and expand our horizons as we learn more and have new experiences and take in more information, I think we would be doing an injustice to God's created design of us, that we too can expand and learn more about God as God reveals new things to us in Scripture and in life and in worship and Bible study and in conversations like the ones you're having today. So the gift of that is that we get to keep pursuing the next thing that God has to teach us. And God is never done teaching us new things, which can be exciting and also a little bit terrifying, right? Because expanding what we know about God might mean that we have to give up or modify a previous understanding that we've had about God. And that can be particularly scary and challenging for a lot of people, especially when we go through the really hard experiences of our lives. I've only been a pastor for 7 years, and I cannot count the number of times that someone has had a death in the family, and their comment is, "Why would God do this?" And I like to listen to this question and hear more about what it is in particular they feel betrayed by about God in this, right? Because the Bible is very honest that all of us will experience death and resurrection, which is the good news. But there's this idea that floats around in Christianity that if someone dies, God has somehow betrayed us. And it can be really hard when the hard thing happens to shift your biblical imagination to say that maybe who I thought God was not the full picture, and maybe God is even better than that, right? It's hard when real life happens, especially when difficult or tragic things happen, for us to learn through that maybe God is showing us a new facet of who God is, right? I like to think of God as the diamond, because if you look through the diamond one way, you're going to see certain things, And if you turn the diamond a different way, you're going to see a whole different set of things. But maybe God is just showing us a new facet of who God is and challenging us to be open to learning about that, right? I want to say this empathetically, that this is hard for all of us when we have to be challenged in a positive way to expand our understanding of who God is, right? Okay, but we do, because this is what God has for us, is that we get to continue to learn and go down this path and explore new things. Okay, so before my last question, my next question, a little explanation. Every year I have the confirmation class who is getting confirmed write a faith statement, and I know that's not new to us here at St. John's, but one of the things I ask them to include in their faith statement is this. What is your one, or maybe not your only one, but one of your unanswered questions about faith? Because the idea of getting confirmed is not to have all the right answers, right? You've already named that you didn't have them all when you were confirmed, right? And so that's not the point of why we do this with our young people, and it's not the point of why we revisit these things and continue growing in faith. But I think it's really important for us as people of faith to know that asking questions is just as important, maybe if not more important, than having the answers, or as I like to say, having responses to our compelling faith questions. There are some questions in faith that I don't think we can answer. I think they are inherently unanswerable, otherwise God would have very specifically answered them in the Bible. God didn't answer every question in there. But asking questions and continuing to pursue what God has for us is faithful. It's okay to admit that you don't have all the answers, and it's probably more honest, honestly. So, think about this for a moment. You might not instantly have an answer, but if you got to sit down with Jesus to have coffee with him, so think casual, you're having kind of a mutual peer conversation, as much as Jesus won't feel like a peer to us, right? He is our Lord and Savior after all. We probably won't feel like this is a peer situation. But if you got to sit down and have coffee one-on-one with Jesus, what would be a compelling question that matters to you that you got to ask? Turn to each other and talk about that. Not to answer those questions, but to share what the questions are. 10 more seconds. 10 more seconds, and we'll wrap up this conversation. Okay, everybody. Once again, I'm so glad that you had so much to say that you keep talking. I love that. Will anyone share? And it occurs to me, sorry, as I was watching you have your questions, I think it would be really fun, maybe as a future ACE series, to collect those questions and have a series that we call Stump Pastor. That could be fun. Pastor Andy and I could draw anonymous questions out of the box, and we could give our best response to the hard questions. That would be fun. Oh boy. A little bit nerve-wracking, but also very much fun. So, I won't ask you to share your questions right now, but I'm sure you had a lot of really good ones, at least from what I could, snippets over here. So, hold on to those questions. Asking questions is a faithful endeavor that we have together. It is not ours to know all the answers, but it is ours to respond in faith and grace and compassion for each other when this happens and when we have crises of faith, or our friends or our neighbors do, right? It is ours to show up in those things and respond together. So, now that we've done sort of an interesting introduction today to the series, oh, we already had that. Why do I have all these duplicates? Okay. So, I want to give you a look ahead at what's next. Lest this whole talking to each other business was not comfortable for you and you want to avoid ACE for the next 5 weeks. Please don't do that. We're not going to be having conversations together in this way every week, but we are going to have some interesting conversations in a different way. So, for these weeks, with all the dates, and this is correct because I just did this morning, we are going to be having panel discussions on each of these catechism topics to hear from our own members about what this means, Luther's question, in our real lives and what it looks like today. So each week, either Pastor Andy or I will moderate the panel discussion, and we'll ask not some of you, but people who have agreed to be panelists ahead of time, how they respond in faith to certain questions about prayer, or the creed and what we believe, or the 10 commandments that relate to God, or the 10 commandments that relate to how we live with our neighbors. We'll have different panelists each time, so we'll hear from a variety of people because faith does not look the same for each of us as we live our lives. It is nuanced and unique, even as we have some things that of course are shared and in common. We do this differently as people of faith. And so we will get together and hear from panelists about what faith really looks like in their lives in this time, to give you some food for thought about what faith looks like for you. It might have something in common with some of our panelist responses. It might be totally different, and that's okay. But the practice here is to think about how our faith leads and guides us throughout our life, and how that can transform as we continue to grow and have new life experiences. Okay? So our panelists are going to get some prepared questions ahead of time, but you will also have a chance to submit questions to them at the end of our session. So if you have a burning, pressing question about something in one of these areas, you can bring that, and we'll see what they have to say. Cool? So just to be clear, in case I didn't say this well, if I don't talk to you ahead of time, or you don't talk to me ahead of time, you're probably not a panelist, right? You're not going to show up to ACE on these weeks and I'll say, you look like a good panelist, come on up. We will already have had a conversation if you are going to be a panelist. Well, we already do have some, but I'm still calling people for panelists. So if any of these sound interesting to you and you would like to be a panelist, also come talk to me, okay? We'll have a few each week, but they'll be different from week to week. And I think this is going to be really fascinating, okay? That is what I have for you today. Does anyone have any questions as we wrap up our introduction to our What Does This Mean series? Any questions? Cool. Well, I want to thank all of you for sharing together in our Turn to Your Neighbor and Discuss questions today. That is a great venture of faith, and thanks for showing up to it and for each other. Thanks for coming, and I hope we'll see you next week for our first panel on prayer. Yeah.